Caroline, my wife, had no idea what I was capable of, and it amused me to let her think I was some washed-up accountant who spent his days balancing budgets. In reality, I had a past she couldn't begin to comprehend. Years in the CIA, running black ops in places no one would ever read about in the papers. I'd left that life behind for her, or so I thought at the time. But lately, her snide remarks, the unexplained late nights, and her phone constantly buzzing with notifications she never showed me. It all painted a picture. I didn't want to believe it at first. I'd given up so much for her, but deep down, I knew. Caroline was cheating. I'd spent weeks gathering evidence quietly, piecing together the puzzle without tipping her off. I hacked her email, tracked her GPS, and even placed a bug in her car. Rudimentary skill from my past life. The data didn't lie. Late-night trips to hotels, cryptic messages from someone named Mark, and an alarming text thread detailing how she couldn't wait to be rid of me. Tonight, though, was different. There was a sharpness in her tone, an edge that told me she was building to something. She put down her fork and leaned forward, staring at me with a gaze that would have intimidated anyone else. I've been thinking, Jason, maybe it's time we reevaluate things. I mean, we've grown apart, haven't we? There it was. The opening salvo. But I wasn't going to play into her game. I nodded slowly, chewing my food with deliberate calm. Is that so? I said, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. I could see her calculating, trying to decide how much to say. I just think we're different people now. Maybe we should think about taking some time apart. I put down my knife and fork, folding my hands in front of me. Is that what you think, or is that what your boyfriend thinks? The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost comical. For once, she was speechless. But I didn't let her stew for long. I reached into my pocket and slid a small flash drive across the table. Everything you've been doing, every message you've sent, every little rendezvous. You've been sloppy, Caroline. Sloppy and predictable. Her eyes darted to the drive, then back to me. Jason, what the hell are you talking about? I leaned back, letting the weight of my words sink in. I know about Mark. I know about the hitman. You think you're clever, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. Her face contorted, anger bubbling to the surface. You're insane. Paranoid. I don't know what you're talking about. I chuckled, a low, cold sound that made her flinch. Keep lying, Caroline. You'll find out just how insane I can be. Caroline's initial shock had been replaced by outrage. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the flash drive, holding it as though it were some kind of grenade. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her voice rising. You're making things up. Is this some pathetic attempt to save a marriage that's already dead? I stayed silent, watching her. Silence, I'd learned over the years, was often louder than words. It made people uncomfortable. It made them reveal more than they intended. Mark is just a friend, she continued, her words spilling out like water through a broken dam. And if I wanted to leave you, I could have done it years ago. Maybe I should have. Still, I said nothing. The subtle tilt of my head and the unwavering gaze were enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her seat. You're not saying anything because you know you don't have anything, she pressed on, trying to regain the upper hand. If you're so convinced I'm this horrible person, why not just leave me? Oh, wait, that's right, you need me. I couldn't help the smirk that tugged at my lips. You're very good at spinning stories, Caroline. It's what makes you dangerous. Her eyes narrowed. What the hell are you talking about? Dangerous, I repeated, leaning forward. You're ambitious, ruthless, and you don't care who gets hurt as long as you get what you want. That's why you thought hiring someone to kill me was a good idea. Her face went pale, a mask of incredulity. But there was something else in her eyes, fear. You're delusional, she said, her voice shaky now. You've completely lost it. Have I? I asked, pulling out my phone and tapping the screen. A recording began to play. Her voice, unmistakably, giving instructions to a man about making it look like an accident. Her cadence, her words, her arrogance. It was all there, undeniable. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You edited that. That's not real. I paused the recording and placed the phone on the table. You've underestimated me in ways I find almost insulting, Caroline. I know about Mark, the payments to his offshore account, the coded messages you thought no one could decipher. I even know the date you set for my accident. I let the word hang in the air. Funny thing is, you had no idea who you were dealing with this entire time? Her lips parted, but no words came out. For once, she was truly speechless. The confident, sharp-tongued woman I'd married was unraveling in front of me, and it was a sight to behold. You think I'm just some guy who pushes numbers around, I said, standing and pacing around the room. You thought I'd roll over and die, literally, because you're so used to getting what you want. But Caroline, I've dealt with people far scarier than you. And trust me, they didn't make it out unscathed. She finally found her voice, though it was shaky. So what now? You kill me? Is that it? Because you've got this delusion that I'm some kind of monster? I stopped pacing and turned to her, my expression darkening. No, Caroline, I don't need to kill you. She flinched at the ice in my tone, but I let her wonder what was coming next. My revenge wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be merciful, and it wouldn't leave her life intact. Caroline stared at me, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. Her attempt at defiance had crumbled, leaving only raw fear in its place. I could see her mind racing, searching for a way out. It was almost pitiful to watch her unravel, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook. Not yet. You're bluffing, she finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. Even if I did say something, you don't have proof. You can't prove anything? I raised an eyebrow. You think so? Walking to the bookshelf, I retrieved a small device, placing it on the table in front of her. It was a GPS tracker. Her eyes widened as she recognized it. I installed this in your car 3 months ago. Every place you've been, every secret meeting, every hotel rendezvous. It's all logged. And then there's this. I slid a folder across the table, filled with screenshots of her messages to Mark and to the hitman. Her hands hovered above it, trembling. When she finally opened it, the color drained from her face. You plan to meet him tomorrow to finalize the details, I said calmly. But he won't be showing up. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with terror. What do you mean? I leaned in close, lowering my voice to a whisper. Because I intercepted him first. Caroline gasped, and her hand flew to her mouth. What did you do? She asked, her voice barely audible. Nothing too drastic, I said with a shrug. I just had a little conversation with him. It turns out he wasn't as loyal to you as you thought. One look at the cash I offered, and he was happy to spill everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't from remorse. They were from panic. Jason, listen to me. No, you listen, I snapped, my voice cutting through hers like a blade. I have everything I need to take you down. The texts, the money trail, the recorded conversations. It's all ready to be handed over to the police. You won't just lose your cushy life. You'll spend the next 20 years in a cell. Her breathing hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might actually beg. But Caroline was too proud for that. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, trying to muster whatever dignity she had left. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice hollow. I smirked, shaking my head. You're not in a position to negotiate, Caroline. I'm not here to make deals. I'm here to show you exactly what happens when you cross the wrong person. Her facade cracked further. You can't ruin my life like this, she hissed. I'll fight you. I'll tell them you're lying, that you doctored all of this. I laughed softly, a cold, humorless sound. Oh, Caroline, you can try, but you're forgetting one thing. I leaned in again, close enough to see the panic in her eyes. I'm not just some ordinary husband. I'm trained to make people disappear without a trace. You think you're scared now? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Her composure shattered completely, and the tears she tried to suppress spilled down her cheeks. Jason, please. I stepped back, my expression icy. Begging doesn't suit you, Caroline. But don't worry. You'll get exactly what you deserve. I let the weight of my words settle before walking out of the room, leaving her alone with the evidence of her betrayal. She didn't realize it yet, but her life was already crumbling. I'd made sure of it. The house was silent except for Caroline's muffled sobs from the dining room. I made my way upstairs to my office, shutting the door behind me. It was time to finalize the next stage of my plan. Revenge wasn't just about retribution. It was about precision, about ensuring the pieces fell into place exactly as I intended. On my desk, the setup was ready. A burner phone linked to an anonymous account, preloaded with the evidence I'd meticulously gathered. Copies of her incriminating conversations with Mark, her payment transfers to the hitman, and even her browser history, researching things like how to stage an accident and common causes of fatal car crashes. The breadcrumbs would all point to one conclusion. Caroline was plotting something sinister, and she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. I sent the package to the local police department, flagged as urgent. Caroline thought she was untouchable, that her lies and charm would shield her from accountability. But she had no idea I'd already set her world on fire. As I hit send, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an encrypted message from an old contact, a guy I'd worked with back in my CIA days. He was retired now, but his network was still solid. The message was brief. It's done. No loose ends. The hitman she'd hired? He wouldn't be an issue anymore. My contact had made sure of that. Caroline had hired him to kill me, but he'd underestimated his target. Now he was gone, and she was utterly alone in her web of deceit. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Despite the grim nature of what I'd set in motion, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Caroline had made her choices, and I was simply ensuring she paid the price. It wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. Later that night, I returned to the dining room. Caroline was still there, slumped in her chair with tear-streaked cheeks. The folder and flash drive were scattered on the table, untouched since I'd left her. "Pack a bag," I said coldly, startling her. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and red. "What? Why? You're leaving tonight," I said. "I've already spoken to your lawyer. You'll sign the divorce papers tomorrow morning, and you'll be gone from my life by the end of the week." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You can't force me to leave," she stammered. "This is my house too." I laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You're mistaken, Caroline. This house is mine. I made sure of it when I realized who you really are. Your name's not on the deed, and I've frozen the joint accounts. You have nothing." She shot to her feet, rage overtaking her fear. "You think you're so clever," she spat. "But I'll fight you. I'll take this to court." "Go ahead," I interrupted. "But by the time the police finish reviewing the evidence I sent them, you'll be fighting from a jail cell. I'm sure they'll love to hear about your little murder-for-hire scheme." Her anger dissolved into panic. "Jason, you can't do this. I'll tell them you set me up." "Good luck," I said, my voice icy. "But I wouldn't count on it. You see, Caroline, I've covered every angle. The trail leads straight to you and your accomplices. There's no room for doubt, no escape." She collapsed back into the chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the table. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this to me?" I leaned forward, letting her see the cold resolve in my eyes. "Because you tried to take everything from me. And now, I'm just returning the favor." Caroline sat frozen in the chair, her lips trembling as she tried to process what I'd just said. The fire that had always fueled her manipulations was gone now, extinguished under the weight of her predicament. She was cornered, and she knew it. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a sleek black folder from behind my back and placed it on the table in front of her. "This," I said, tapping the cover, "is the divorce agreement. It's simple. Sign it, and you get to walk away with whatever dignity you have left." Her eyes darted to the folder, then back to me. "And if I don't?" I smirked. "Then you get to see how thorough I've been. The police will be here within hours, and they won't need much convincing after they go through the evidence." She stared at me, disbelief and anger warring on her face. "You can't do this to me," she hissed. "You don't have the right." "Oh, I have every right," I said, leaning closer. "You gave it to me the moment you decided to play God with my life." For a moment, I thought she might throw the folder at me. Instead, she opened it, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "You're leaving me with nothing," she said, her voice thick with rage. "No money, No property. How do you expect me to survive? That's not my problem, I said flatly. You were planning to survive just fine without me, remember? Or did you think Mark was going to fund your new life? Her face contorted at the mention of his name. Mark has nothing to do with this, she spat. Doesn't he? I said, arching an eyebrow. He seemed pretty eager to sell you out once I showed him the stakes. Did you really think someone as slimy as him was going to risk his neck for you? The fury in her eyes faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. You talked to him? I did, I said, enjoying the look of panic spreading across her face. And he was very forthcoming. You might want to rethink who you trust next time, if there is a next time. Her hands clenched into fists on the table, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then she sank back into the chair, her shoulders slumping in defeat. What do you want from me, Jason? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned down so we were eye to eye. What I want, Caroline, is to watch you suffer the way you wanted me to. I want you to feel the weight of every lie, every betrayal. And then, I want you to disappear. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing for her anymore. No sympathy, no regret, just cold satisfaction. An hour later, the divorce agreement was signed, and Caroline had retreated upstairs to pack her things. I watched her go, her steps slow and heavy, as though she were walking to the gallows. She didn't know the half of it. When she was out of sight, I reached for my phone and made the call. It's done, I said simply. On the other end, my contact chuckled. Understood. What about her? Leave her alone for now, I said. She'll destroy herself just fine without our help. I hung up and poured myself a drink, savoring the stillness of the house. For the first time in years, I felt free. But this wasn't the end, not yet. There was one more twist left in this game, and Caroline wouldn't see it coming. Caroline emerged from the bedroom with 2 suitcases, her eyes bloodshot and her face pale. She'd changed into simple jeans and a sweater, clothes far removed from the tailored dresses and designer outfits she'd always favored. I guess she wanted to avoid drawing attention as she left the house she'd once lorded over like a queen. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, clutching the handle of her luggage. Where do you want me to go? She asked, her voice devoid of its usual bite. That's up to you, I said coolly, swirling the bourbon in my glass. But if you think you can stay in this town and rebuild your life, you're sorely mistaken. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. She knew better by now. Instead, she pulled out her phone, probably to book a hotel. It was almost amusing watching her stumble through the motions of planning her exile. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Before you go, I said, setting my glass down, there's something you should know. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. What now? I reached into my pocket and pulled out another small envelope, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of her. Take a look. She eyed it warily before stepping forward and picking it up. Slowly, she opened the envelope and pulled out its contents, a series of photos. Her face twisted in confusion as she flipped through them, her confusion giving way to horror. They were pictures of her, taken over the past month, at restaurants, in parking lots, entering and leaving Mark's apartment. But the last few photos were the real punch to the gut. Her meeting with the hitman, captured in startling detail. Her hands shook as she held the photos. How did you? I told you, Caroline, I interrupted, leaning forward. You had no idea who you were dealing with. She dropped the photos as though they'd burned her and backed away, her breathing quick and shallow. You've been following me, she whispered. Not personally, I said with a smirk, but I've had eyes on you for weeks. Every move, every scheme. It's all documented. Her back hit the wall, and she stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. Why are you doing this? She choked out. Why are you tormenting me? I stood and walked toward her, my steps measured and deliberate. Because you thought you could destroy me. You thought you could kill me and walk away with my money, my life. You thought I was weak. I need you to understand, Caroline. You were wrong. She flinched as I reached out, but I didn't touch her. Instead, I plucked the photos from the floor and tucked them back into the envelope. These are just copies, I said. The originals are safe, and they've been sent to multiple places, lawyers, contacts, even a few news outlets. You step out of line, and they'll all come to light. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands. Please, she sobbed. Please don't do this. I crouched down to her level, my voice calm and steady. It's already done, Caroline. Now, take your bags and get out. You're finished here. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She simply picked herself up, grabbed her suitcases, and walked out the door, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the night. As the door slammed shut behind her, I exhaled, a sense of finality washing over me. But this wasn't the end, not for her at least. The seeds of her downfall had been planted, and they would continue to grow long after she was gone. After the door slammed shut, I stood in the silence for a moment, letting the satisfaction of her departure settle in. But my work wasn't over. Caroline might have been out of the house, but her next moves would be desperate, and desperate people were unpredictable. I needed to make sure there was no way she could claw her way back. I picked up my phone and dialed a number from memory. The line clicked after a single ring. It's done, I said without preamble. She's out. The voice on the other end was low and familiar, belonging to my old CIA contact, Donovan. You want me to keep tabs on her? Not yet, I said. I have something else in mind first. That offshore account, Mark's account. Can you make it disappear? Donovan chuckled darkly. Oh, I can do more than that. You want it drained or flagged? Flagged, I said. Make it look like it's tied to something nasty, money laundering maybe. I want both their names tied to it, Mark and Caroline. There was a pause, followed by a whistle. Cold, man. You sure about this? She tried to kill me, Donovan, I said, my voice icy. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about making sure she can't do this to anyone else. Fair enough, Donovan replied. Consider it done. Anything else? Not for now. I'll handle the rest. I hung up and sat back, my mind already working through the next steps. The next morning, I saw the first cracks in Caroline's composure. She hadn't gone far, checking into a low-end hotel just outside of town, likely trying to save what little money she had left. I knew this because I'd had her phone cloned. Every text, every call, every desperate plea she sent to Mark, I saw in real time. Her messages were frantic, accusing Mark of abandoning her, demanding he help her. His responses were dismissive at best, hostile at worst. He was already trying to distance himself, likely sensing the heat from the flagged account. It was only a matter of time before he cut her off entirely. But Caroline wasn't the type to go quietly. By the afternoon, she'd called her lawyer, trying to backtrack on the divorce agreement. That was amusing to watch. The lawyer's response was curt and professional. The agreement was airtight, and she'd signed it voluntarily. There was no way out. By the evening, I received confirmation from Donovan. The offshore account had been flagged, and Mark's name was already under investigation. Caroline's connection to the account wouldn't take long to surface. When it did, she'd find herself tangled in a legal nightmare. The thought brought a faint smile to my lips as I poured another glass of bourbon. The beauty of the plan wasn't just its precision. It was the inevitability. Caroline and Mark had thought they were in control, but every step they'd taken had only tightened the web I'd spun around them. As I sipped my drink, my phone buzzed with another notification. It was a message from Caroline, sent to one of her friends, a shallow woman I'd always disliked. I don't know what to do. He's ruined me. I have nothing left. I'll make him pay for this. I swear I will. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. She still hadn't learned. She still thought she could fight me. But I wasn't worried. I'd already won. The next morning, I woke to a storm brewing. Caroline had decided to escalate. My cloned feed of her phone showed a flurry of texts and calls to old friends, distant acquaintances, and even Mark, all with a singular aim: to rally anyone she could to her side. He's lying, one of her messages read. Jason is manipulating everything. I need help before he ruins my life. The desperation was palpable. But even as I watched her scramble, I knew she'd find no allies. Over the past few months, I'd quietly worked to sever her connections, exposing her lies to those she leaned on. Her friends had seen enough of her true nature, and their responses now ranged from curt dismissals to outright ghosting. Mark, as I predicted, was no longer responding at all. The flagged account had spooked him, and with his name tied to potential money laundering, he was likely too busy covering his tracks to care about Caroline's pleas. But Caroline wasn't giving up. Around noon, she made her boldest move yet. She went to the police. I'd anticipated this. The moment I saw her text a contact about visiting the local precinct, I activated the second phase of my plan. By the time she arrived, the officer she spoke to already had a neatly packaged file on her, complete with evidence linking her to the flagged offshore account, the hitman, and even her affair with Mark. I couldn't help but admire the poetic symmetry. She'd gone to the police thinking she could frame me as a manipulative monster, only to find herself walking into a carefully laid trap. That evening, Donovan called with an update. "She tried to accuse you of stalking her," he said, amusement evident in his tone. "Showed them pictures of you and everything." "And?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "And they didn't buy it," he said. "Your evidence package did its job. Between the flagged account and her dealings with the hitman, she looks like a desperate criminal trying to save her own skin. The precinct is already investigating her." I smiled, swirling the bourbon in my glass. "Good. There's more," Donovan said. "They're pulling her phone records and financial. It's only a matter of time before they charge her. She won't have room to breathe, let alone fight back." "Perfect," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Let me know if anything changes." By nightfall, I saw the cracks widen. Caroline's frantic text had slowed to a trickle, her messages growing more erratic and incoherent. She was unraveling, just as I'd planned. But then, just before midnight, a new message caught my eye. A text to an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk. I have a plan to fix this." It was vague, but the implication was clear. Caroline wasn't giving up. She thought she still had one move left to play. I smiled to myself, already strategizing. Let her try. Whatever she was planning, I'd be there to make sure it failed. The next day, Caroline made her move. Her text to the unknown number had been a calculated gamble, or at least she thought so. Unfortunately for her, the recipient of that text was already under scrutiny. Thanks to Donovan's network, I knew exactly who she was meeting. A local fixer with a reputation for working on the wrong side of the law. A desperate move, but then, desperation had become her trademark. Through a discreet tracking app installed on her phone, I followed her GPS location in real time. She left her cheap motel around 3 p.m. and headed to an industrial area on the outskirts of town. A place where no one would ask questions, no matter what went down. Predictable, really. I arrived first, parking a block away in an unmarked car. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the warehouse she was heading toward. It was a dilapidated building with rusted walls and broken windows, the kind of place that screamed bad intentions. Through binoculars, I watched as Caroline's car pulled up. She stepped out, her posture tense, her movements hurried. She glanced around nervously before entering the warehouse. My heart rate didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. Years of fieldwork had prepared me for moments like this, and the stakes felt almost laughably low compared to what I'd faced before. I waited 5 minutes before following her inside. A rear entrance offered the perfect point of entry. The door creaked faintly as I slipped through, staying in the shadows. Voices echoed faintly from somewhere deep within the building. "Are you out of your mind?" a man's voice said, sharp and incredulous. Caroline's voice followed, frantic and pleading. "You don't understand. He's destroying my life. I need this handled, quickly and permanently." The fixer sighed audibly. "You're asking for a miracle, lady. If this guy's as connected as you say, going after him is suicide, for both of us." "I'll pay you double," she said, her desperation palpable. "I just need him gone." I smirked in the darkness. Her inability to learn from past mistakes was almost comical. She truly believed money could fix anything, but she didn't realize she was trying to buy her way out of a trap I'd already closed. Stepping closer, I positioned myself behind a stack of crates, just a few feet from where they stood. The fixer, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, looked irritated, pacing as Caroline gestured wildly. "Look," he said, stopping mid-step. "I'm not saying no, but I need assurances. If this guy's former CIA, He's got connections. You're playing with fire. Caroline crossed her arms, defiant. I'll handle any fallout. I just need you to take care of him. I decided it was time to intervene. Stepping out from behind the crates, I let my footsteps echo deliberately. Both of them froze, their heads snapping toward me as I emerged from the shadows. Funny, I said, my voice calm but cutting. I was just about to say the same thing. Caroline gasped, stumbling back as though she'd seen a ghost. Jason, what are you doing here? The fixer's hand moved to his waistband, but I was faster. My weapon was out before he could draw, its barrel trained squarely on his chest. Don't, I said flatly. You won't like how it ends. The fixer hesitated, then raised his hand slowly, his eyes darting between me and Caroline. Hey man, I don't know what this is about. Oh, you know exactly what it's about, I said, stepping closer. You just didn't expect your new client to bring the guest of honor. Caroline's voice cracked. Jason, please, let me explain. I turned my gaze to her, and she shrank under its weight. You've done enough explaining, Caroline. I think it's time you listened. The warehouse fell silent as my words hung in the air. Caroline's wide eyes darted between me and the fixer, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The fixer stood frozen, his hand still raised, his expression a mix of caution and curiosity. I kept my weapon trained on him, but my focus was on her. Explain what? I said, my voice low and deliberate. That you're here, once again, trying to get me killed? That you've somehow convinced yourself this is the way out of the mess you created? She took a shaky step back, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. Jason, You thought you could control everything. I cut her off, taking a measured step forward. You thought you were clever, but you're just reckless. Stupid, even. And now, here you are, standing in the wreckage of your own making. The fixer shifted slightly, testing my attention. My aim adjusted instantly, the click of the safety snapping off echoing like a gunshot. He froze again. Don't, I said coldly. This doesn't concern you yet. He nodded slowly, his hands still in the air. Fair enough. I turned my attention back to Caroline, who was trembling now, her confidence completely shattered. You don't get to talk your way out of this, I said. Not this time. Do you understand what you've done? You've dragged someone else into your mess, a man who would have killed me if he'd had the chance. And for what? To save yourself? To avoid the consequences of your own greed and betrayal? Her lips quivered, but no sound came out. It was almost pitiful. Almost. Jason, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want it to come to this. I laughed softly, a dark, humorless sound. No, Caroline, you wanted this. You planned for it. You just didn't plan for me to fight back. I motioned for the fixer to lower his hands. You. Sit. He obeyed without hesitation, perching on a crate, his eyes never leaving the barrel of my weapon. I turned my full attention to Caroline. Do you know what happens now? I asked her, her eyes filled with tears. Please, she whispered. Please, Jason, don't. You don't get to beg, I snapped, my voice cutting through her like a blade. You made your choices. Now you live with them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, pressing a single button. Seconds later, the sound of tires screeching outside filled the air. The police were here, right on cue. The evidence I'd sent them, of her dealings with this fixer, the flagged account, and her previous attempt to hire a hitman, was enough to ensure they wouldn't hesitate. You called the cops? The fixer muttered, his tone incredulous. Man, what kind of game are you playing? I ignored him, focusing on Caroline. This is the end of the road for you, I said. You'll answer for everything you've done. And when you're sitting in a cell, wondering where it all went wrong, just remember this moment. Remember that you had every chance to walk away, and you threw it all away. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, sobbing. Jason, please. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I see that now. Just please, don't do this. I crouched down, meeting her tear-filled gaze with a cold, unflinching stare. You were wrong, I said softly, and now you'll pay. The sound of doors slamming and voices shouting grew louder. The police were closing in. I stood and holstered my weapon, stepping away from her. The fixer cursed under his breath, but he didn't move. He knew better. As the first officers burst into the warehouse, I raised my hands in mock surrender, a faint smirk playing on my lips. "I'm unarmed," I said. "The ones you're looking for are right there." The officers stormed past me, their guns trained on Caroline and the fixer. I watched as they cuffed her, ignoring her frantic pleas and tearful protests. This was her reckoning, and there would be no escape. As I walked out of the warehouse, the cold night air hit my face. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. But the game wasn't over yet, not entirely. There was still one final move to make. The scene outside the warehouse was controlled chaos, police lights flashing, officers barking orders, and Caroline's anguished cries as she was shoved into the back of a squad car. I stood across the street, arms folded, watching from the shadows. She looked out the car window, her tear-streaked face desperate and searching. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no pity in my gaze, only finality. She had sealed her fate, and we both knew it. I left before the officers could ask too many questions. Donovan's contacts had ensured that my role in this mess would remain buried, and the story presented to the police was airtight. Caroline and her fixer had conspired to commit multiple crimes, and the evidence left no room for doubt. The flagged offshore account, her dealings with Mark, and her attempt to hire a hitman painted a damning picture. I wasn't just free from her machinations, I was untouchable. The next morning, I received a call from Donovan. "Your girl's in deep," he said, his tone more amused than surprised. "They've got her on conspiracy charges, solicitation of murder, and fraud. She'll be lucky to see the outside of a cell again." "Good," I said simply. "Mark's in the crosshairs too," Donovan continued. "Looks like he's trying to cut a deal. Claimed he had no idea about the hitman, but the offshore account ties him to enough shady business that he won't walk away clean." I leaned back in my chair, letting the news wash over me. It was poetic, really. The two people who had tried to destroy me were now destroying each other, clawing for survival in a mess of their own making. But there was still one loose end. Mark. Unlike Caroline, he wasn't finished yet. He might try to take the easy way out by flipping on her, but I wasn't going to give him that chance. He had played his part in her schemes, fueled her delusions, and profited from her betrayal. He wasn't walking away unscathed. Using the same network that had flagged the offshore account, I arranged for a new layer of complications. Mark's business dealings, which were shady at best, suddenly became the focus of a federal investigation. Tax evasion, fraudulent contracts, and ties to questionable entities. His empire was built on a foundation of lies, and it was crumbling faster than he could patch it up. By the end of the week, Mark's assets were frozen, his business shuttered, and his name plastered across every major news outlet. He wasn't just facing legal battles, he was being publicly destroyed. 2 days later, I received an anonymous email. It was a single sentence: "He's out of the game." Attached was a photograph of Mark being escorted into a federal building in handcuffs, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. I forwarded the email to Donovan with a simple reply: "Tie up the rest. No loose ends." His response came minutes later: "Consider it done." As I sat in my quiet house that evening, sipping bourbon and staring at the now irrelevant folder of evidence on my desk, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was over. Truly over. Caroline and Mark had been dismantled, their lives destroyed by the very schemes they'd crafted. They were prisoners of their own ambition, and I was finally free. But even as I closed the folder and tossed it into the fire, I knew this wasn't about justice. Justice was about fairness, and there had been nothing fair about what they'd done to me. This was about retribution, about making sure they could never hurt anyone again. As the flames consumed the folder, I poured another glass of bourbon and allowed myself a rare smile. They had played their game, and they had lost. In the days following Caroline's arrest, a profound quiet settled over my life. It wasn't the absence of noise, exactly. It was the absence of chaos. For the first time in years, there were no late-night arguments, no suspicious glances at her phone, no calculating what she might do next. The house felt different, lighter, as though her venom had seeped into its walls and evaporated the moment she left. I sat on the back porch, staring out at the woods behind the house. The last remnants of winter clung stubbornly to the branches, but there was a hint of spring in the air. The world was moving on, and so was I. But something lingered, a nagging thought at the edge of my mind. Had I gone too far? It wasn't guilt. I didn't regret a single step I'd taken. But there was a weight to what I'd done, a recognition of the lengths I'd gone to dismantle two lives. Caroline and Mark weren't good people, but I had obliterated them without mercy. There was no coming back for either of them, no path to redemption, and I wasn't sure if that made me feel victorious or hollow. A week later, I got a call from Donovan. "You're clear," he said, his voice steady. "Caroline's facing enough charges to bury her, and Mark's tied up in federal court. Neither of them will have the bandwidth to come after you. Not that they dare." "Good," I said. "There's something else," he added, and I detected a note of hesitation in his tone. "What?" "She's been trying to contact you. From jail." I frowned, leaning forward in my chair. "Why?" "Hard to say. She's probably desperate, looking for some way to appeal to your sympathy." I scoffed. She wasted her breath. "That's what I figured," Donovan said. "But I thought you'd want to know." I ended the call and set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. What could she possibly have to say to me now? Apologies? Excuses? Another attempt to manipulate me? Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had no intention of hearing it. That night, I burned the last of her belongings. Clothes, photographs, sentimental trinkets she'd left behind. It all went into the fire. Watching the flames consume the remnants of her presence felt cathartic, like closing the final page of a long, painful chapter. By the time the fire died down, I felt lighter, free. But freedom, I realized, came with its own weight. Caroline and Mark were gone, but the scars they'd left behind remained. They were a reminder of what I'd endured and what I'd become to survive.